The sun was just beginning to rise over the small town of Riverside as Clara Martinez bustled around the kitchen of her modest bakery. Sweet beginnings. Flour dusted her apron, and the warm smell of freshly baked bread filled the room. It was a typical morning for Clara, who had run the bakery single-handedly for years. She started her day before dawn, kneading dough, preparing pastries, and setting up her shop for the early morning crowd of regulars. Clara wasn't rich, but she was content. Her customers adored her for the kindness she showed and the way her smile could brighten even the darkest of days. But despite the warmth she received from the community, Clara was struggling behind the scenes. Her bills were mounting, and she had barely enough money to keep the bakery afloat. She had dreams of expanding, of turning her small shop into a thriving business, but those dreams seemed more distant with each passing day. It was a Friday morning when everything changed. The day started like any other. Clara woke before the sun, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and prepared the bakery for the morning rush. Her first customers were always the same. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly widow who lived down the street and loved Clara's cinnamon rolls. Then Tommy Rivera, the young man who worked at the local mechanic shop and always grabbed a coffee before heading off to fix cars. These were the people who made up Clara's world, simple, familiar, and predictable. By mid-morning, as Clara wiped the counters and arranged a fresh batch of croissants in the display case, a sharp knock on the front door caught her attention. Clara frowned. It wasn't the usual time for deliveries, and she wasn't expecting any new customers. Wiping her hands on her apron, she walked to the door and opened it to reveal a well-dressed woman holding a sleek black envelope. "Clara Martinez?" the woman asked, her voice clipped but polite. Clara nodded, her curiosity piqued. The woman handed her the envelope without another word and turned to leave. Clara called out after her, "Wait, who is this from?" The woman paused briefly, her eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and professionalism. "It's from Mr. Dylan Reyes. You'll want to read that carefully." Clara's heart skipped a beat at the name. Everyone in Riverside knew who Dylan Reyes was. He was the town's elusive billionaire, a man of immense wealth and influence, but who rarely made public appearances. He owned half the town, including most of the commercial real estate, and yet very few people had ever spoken to him directly. The rumors surrounding him were endless. Some said he was a ruthless businessman, while others claimed he was a generous philanthropist who preferred to remain out of the spotlight. Either way, Clara had no idea why someone like him would be sending her anything. She closed the door, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of expensive, cream-colored stationery with neat, typed words. "Dear Ms. Martinez, I have heard of your bakery through mutual acquaintances and would like to extend a formal request for your services. I am hosting a private event at my residence in 1 week's time and would be honored if you would cater the event. The details of the arrangement are enclosed, along with a generous advance. I understand you may not have catered such an event before, but I am confident in your abilities. Please contact my assistant at the number below if you are interested. Sincerely, Dylan Reyes." Clara's head spun as she read the letter. She had catered small events before, birthdays, local fundraisers, but nothing on the scale of what a billionaire might require. The enclosed details mentioned an elegant dinner for 50 of the most influential people in the region, along with a hefty payment that would be enough to cover her bakery's bills for months. Clara sat down at one of the bakery's small tables, the letter still in her hands. This could change everything. But alongside the excitement, Clara felt a wave of doubt. This was way out of her league. What if she failed? What if her simple, homemade recipes weren't good enough for the high society crowd that mingled with billionaires like Dylan Reyes? She didn't even know how to organize a team to cater such an event. Her bakery was a one-woman operation. As the day wore on, Clara wrestled with her decision. She knew this opportunity was once in a lifetime. It wasn't just about the money, though that was desperately needed. It was about proving to herself that she could step out of her comfort zone and succeed in a world far removed from her own. But what if accepting this offer was a mistake? What if she embarrassed herself in front of the wealthiest people in town? That evening, Clara confided in her best friend Alina, who had grown up with her and was always the voice of reason in her life. They sat at Clara's kitchen table, the letter between them. "Are you crazy, Clara?" Elena asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "This is an amazing opportunity. You've been talking about wanting to expand the bakery for years. This could be your big break." Clara bit her lip. "But I don't even know where to start. I've never catered an event like this. What if I mess up?" Elena placed a hand on her friend's arm. "You won't mess up. You've been running this bakery on your own for years. You're more capable than you think. Plus, if you don't take this chance, you'll always wonder what could have happened." Clara knew Elena was right. The thought of saying no left a pit in her stomach. If she walked away now, she would regret it for the rest of her life. And so, after hours of deliberation, Clara made the decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and dialed the number provided in the letter. The following week flew by in a blur of preparations. Clara threw herself into the work, spending late nights in the bakery, planning the menu, and sourcing ingredients she had never used before. She hired a small team to help her, borrowing staff from other local restaurants and calling in favors from friends. The day of the event arrived faster than she anticipated. The evening was warm and filled with the golden hues of sunset as Clara and her team arrived at Dylan Reyes' estate. The mansion loomed before them like something out of a fairy tale, its vast stone walls and manicured gardens exuding an air of untouchable wealth. Clara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest, but there was no turning back now. As she stepped through the grand doors, the bustling atmosphere inside took her breath away. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits filled the room, their laughter mingling with the sound of a live orchestra. Clara's team moved efficiently, setting up the food and ensuring everything was perfect, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. And then, through the crowd, she saw him, Dylan Reyes. He was taller than she expected, with dark, carefully styled hair and an air of quiet confidence. He moved through the room with ease, speaking to his guests with the practiced charm of someone used to the spotlight. As he approached the buffet, Clara suddenly found herself face to face with him. He gave her a small, approving smile. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice smooth and deep, "you've outdone yourself." Clara barely had time to respond before he was whisked away by another guest. But his words stuck with her, filling her with a sense of pride and nervous energy. The night went by in a blur, but as Clara packed up her things and prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. She had accepted the offer, but little did she know, her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The days following the event at Dylan Reyes' mansion were a whirlwind of emotions for Clara. After the initial excitement of successfully catering for the wealthiest man in town, she returned to the bakery with a deep sense of accomplishment. Word about her work at the event spread quickly, and new customers started trickling into Sweet Beginnings, eager to taste the treats that had graced the tables of the rich and famous. But beneath the surface, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was looming. She hadn't seen Dylan after their brief encounter at the event, but his enigmatic presence and the fleeting smile he'd offered stayed with her. She was certain she'd made a good impression, but something about that night, the whispers of the guests, and the subtle undercurrents in the atmosphere made her wonder if Dylan's invitation was about more than just catering. 3 days after the event, Clara was wiping down the bakery's counters when the bell over the door chimed. She looked up, expecting to see one of her regulars, but instead, a tall man in a sharply tailored suit walked in. His posture was perfect, his movements graceful yet deliberate, and in his hand, he carried a familiar black envelope. Clara's stomach flipped. "Ms. Martinez." The man's voice was crisp and formal, much like the assistant who had delivered the first letter. He walked toward her with an air of authority, but there was something in his eyes that made Clara uneasy. "Yes," she replied, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "I'm Mr. Reyes' assistant. He would like to invite you to a private meeting at his estate this evening. It's regarding a personal matter. He handed her the envelope, but this time there was no brief explanation or pleasantries. The man turned and left as quickly as he'd arrived, leaving Clara standing behind the counter, staring at the sleek envelope in her hands. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. A personal meeting. What could Dylan Reyes possibly want from her? She had fulfilled her end of the catering deal. What else could there be? With a mix of curiosity and trepidation, Clara opened the envelope. Inside was a simple note. Ms. Martinez, I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss a proposal with you in person. Please join me at my residence this evening at 7 p.m. I look forward to our conversation. Sincerely, Dylan Reyes. Clara's mind raced. A proposal? What kind of proposal? She couldn't deny the intrigue pulling at her, but there was also a sense of apprehension. Why would a man like Dylan Reyes be interested in her? She was a small-town baker, not someone who moved in his elite circles. As the day wore on, Clara found herself unable to focus on her usual tasks. She moved around the bakery in a haze, distracted by thoughts of what the meeting could be about. Her friends, sensing her distraction, tried to pry the reason out of her, but Clara kept the details to herself. She didn't want to stir up any unnecessary gossip, especially when she didn't even know what this was about. By 6:30 p.m., Clara had closed the bakery early and returned home to change into something more appropriate for a meeting with a billionaire. She settled on a simple but elegant dress, nothing too flashy, but far removed from her usual work attire. Her heart pounded as she drove to Dylan's estate, her mind swirling with possibilities. Could this be some sort of business opportunity, or was it something more personal? The towering gates of Dylan's estate loomed ahead as she arrived. Clara's palms were slick with sweat as she drove up the long driveway, passing perfectly manicured gardens and elegant statues. The mansion itself stood like a fortress, its towering spires and stone facade casting long shadows in the fading light of dusk. A butler greeted her at the door and led her through the expansive halls, filled with priceless art and the faint scent of fresh flowers. Clara couldn't help but feel small in comparison to the opulence around her. Finally, they arrived at a private study, where Dylan was waiting. The room was filled with rich mahogany furniture, bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vast gardens. Dylan stood by one of the windows, looking out into the twilight, his silhouette framed by the last light of the day. He turned as she entered, a small, unreadable smile on his lips. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth and warm. "Thank you for coming." Clara offered a polite smile, though her nerves were still on edge. "Of course. I was surprised to hear from you again." Dylan gestured for her to sit in one of the plush chairs by the fireplace. "I'm sure you're wondering why I asked you here. I appreciate your work at the event, but this meeting is about something else entirely." Clara sat down, her hands folded in her lap, trying to maintain her composure. "Yes, I've been curious." Dylan took a seat across from her, his expression serious but calm. "I'm a man who values discretion and loyalty. Ms. Martinez, you've demonstrated both through your hard work and professionalism. I have a proposition for you, but I must warn you. It's unconventional." Clara's pulse quickened. "Unconventional how?" He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense but not unkind. "I need a partner. Not a business partner, but a personal companion." Clara blinked, not sure she had heard him correctly. "A companion." Dylan nodded, his tone still matter-of-fact. "I find myself in need of someone to accompany me to various social events, to present a certain image. But this isn't just about appearances. I need someone trustworthy, someone from outside the circles of wealth and power, who can keep my private life private." Clara felt a cold rush of confusion. "Why me?" Dylan smiled faintly. "You're not like the others. You're grounded, humble, and genuine, qualities that are rare in my world. You're also someone who has her own ambitions, but hasn't let them compromise her integrity. That's why I believe you're the right person for this arrangement." Clara's mind was racing. A personal companion. This was beginning to sound like something out of a strange fairy tale. And what exactly would this arrangement involve? Dylan reached into his pocket and pulled out another envelope. He slid it across the table to her. "Inside are the terms of the contract. In short, you would attend events with me, pose as my partner when necessary, and in return, you would be generously compensated." Clara stared at the envelope, her hands still in her lap. Her instincts were screaming at her that something about this was off, but she couldn't deny the temptation. She was barely scraping by, and the thought of financial security was incredibly alluring. But this was more than she had bargained for. She wasn't some hired companion, and the very idea seemed absurd. "I'm not sure what to say," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Dylan's expression softened, and for the first time since she had met him, he seemed vulnerable. "I understand that this is unusual, Clara, and I won't pressure you. Take your time to think it over. You don't need to decide tonight." Clara hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, this was a business proposition. A strange one, but still just business. On the other, it felt deeply personal, almost invasive. What kind of life would she be stepping into if she agreed? She had worked so hard to build her bakery, her little slice of happiness, but could she really say no to an offer that could change her life forever? Finally, Clara stood, clutching the envelope in her hand. "I'll need some time to think about this." Dylan stood as well, giving her a small nod. "Take all the time you need. I'm confident you'll make the right choice." As Clara left the estate, the weight of the envelope felt heavier in her hands with each step she took. She had come here expecting a simple business conversation, but what she had received was a life-altering offer. The town of Riverside had always been her safe haven, a place where she could live quietly and work hard. But now, the billionaire's proposition dangled before her, tempting her with the promise of financial freedom and an escape from her day-to-day struggles. But at what cost? As Clara drove back home, the darkening sky reflected her swirling thoughts. She was no closer to making a decision, but one thing was clear: her life, her future, hung in the balance of this strange, unexpected offer. The envelope sat untouched on the kitchen table, staring back at Clara as she moved around her small apartment, her mind in turmoil. It had been 2 days since her meeting with Dylan Reyes, and she still hadn't opened it. She had tried to distract herself with the usual routine: baking, managing the bakery, chatting with customers, but nothing could keep her thoughts from drifting back to that conversation. A personal companion, a contract to attend events, stand by his side, and what? Pretend to be something she wasn't. Clara had never imagined herself in a world like Dylan's. She had always been content with her quiet life in Riverside, far removed from the glitz and glamour of the wealthy. But this offer, as bizarre as it seemed, dangled the promise of something she had never allowed herself to consider: financial freedom. The bakery was her life's work, but it was also her biggest burden. Clara was constantly worried about money, rent, bills, paying her staff. And no matter how hard she worked, it always felt like she was one disaster away from losing everything. Dylan's offer could change that. If she accepted, she wouldn't have to worry about the bakery's future. She could expand, hire more help, and finally take a breath. But there was another side to this offer that gnawed at her conscience. What kind of person would she become if she accepted? Would she lose herself in Dylan's world, become just another accessory in his life of wealth and influence? The thought made her uneasy. On the third morning after the meeting, Clara finally worked up the nerve to open the envelope. She unfolded the crisp paper inside and scanned the document, her eyes widening as she read the terms. Agreement of companionship services. Duration: 1 year. Payment: $500,000, paid in monthly installments. Duties: attend all required events, travel as needed, and maintain the appearance of a personal relationship with Dylan Reyes. Confidentiality clause: All aspects of this agreement must remain confidential. Any breach of this clause will result in termination of payment and legal action. Termination. Either party may terminate the contract with 30 days' notice. Clara set the paper down, her hands trembling slightly. $500,000. That was more than she had ever dreamed of earning in her lifetime. With that kind of money, she could secure the future of her bakery, pay off her debts, and maybe even help her family. But the rest of the contract felt cold, clinical. The phrase, "maintain the appearance of a personal relationship," stood out to her like a flashing red light. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't personal. It was a transaction. A business arrangement disguised as something intimate. That afternoon, Clara closed the bakery early and called Alina, her best friend. She needed advice, and there was no one she trusted more than Alina, who had always been the voice of reason in her life. They met at a small cafe near the town square, a cozy place where they had spent countless hours over the years, talking about their dreams, their failures, and everything in between. As soon as Clara sat down, Alina knew something was wrong. "What's going on? You look like you haven't slept in days," Alina said, her eyes narrowing in concern. Clara sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I need your help. I have this situation, and I don't know what to do." Alina leaned in, her curiosity piqued. "Is this about that catering gig with Dylan Reyes? I heard it went great." Clara nodded, taking a deep breath. "It's about him, but it's not about the catering. He made me an offer, a really strange offer." Alina raised an eyebrow. "What kind of offer?" Clara hesitated for a moment, then told her everything. She explained the meeting at his mansion, the contract, and the terms, how Dylan wanted her to be his companion for a year, attending events with him and pretending to be his partner. By the time she finished, Alina's eyes were wide with disbelief. "Wait, he wants you to pretend to be his girlfriend? For money?" Alina asked, her voice a mix of shock and incredulity. Clara nodded, biting her lip. "I know it sounds insane. I didn't believe it at first either. But it's real. He even sent me a contract. He's offering $500,000, Alina. $500,000. Alina was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer. "And you're actually considering it?" Clara looked down at her hands. "I don't know what to do. The money would change everything. I could finally fix the bakery, hire more help, pay off my debts. But it feels wrong. Like I'm selling a part of myself." Alina leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as she considered her friend's words. "It's a lot of money, Clara. And I get why you're tempted. But you need to think about what this could do to you. Not just financially, but emotionally. You'd be living a lie, pretending to be someone you're not. Can you really do that for a year?" Clara sighed. "I don't know. I've been going back and forth on it for days. It feels like this could be my only chance to save the bakery, but I don't want to lose myself in the process." Alina reached across the table, taking Clara's hand. "I get it, but you need to remember who you are. You're not some prop for a billionaire's life. You're Clara Martinez. You built your bakery from the ground up. You're strong, independent, and people love you for who you are, not for how much money you have." Clara smiled weakly. Alina was right. She had always prided herself on being self-reliant, on working hard for everything she had. But the weight of her financial struggles pressed down on her, and she couldn't shake the thought that this might be her only way out. That night, Clara lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The contract sat on her nightstand, the terms repeating in her mind like a broken record. She thought about her bakery, about the sleepless nights she had spent worrying about bills, about how close she had come to losing it all more than once. She also thought about Dylan. What kind of man made an offer like this? He had seemed so composed, so sure of himself when he presented the proposal, but Clara couldn't help but wonder what lay beneath that calm exterior. Was he as cold and calculated as the contract suggested, or was there something more to him? The next morning, Clara made her decision. She arrived at Dylan's estate just after 10 a.m. The gates swung open as her car approached, and a butler led her to the same study where they had met before. Dylan was already there, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in hand. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Clara, I wasn't expecting you so soon." Clara stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her. "I've thought about your offer, and I've decided to accept." Dylan didn't smile, but there was a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good. I think you'll find that this arrangement will benefit us both." Clara nodded, though her stomach twisted with uncertainty. "But I have one condition." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Clara took a deep breath. "I need to know why. Why are you doing this? Why me?" Dylan set down his coffee and walked toward her, his gaze steady. "Because I need someone I can trust. Someone who isn't part of the world I live in. The people around me, they all want something. Power, money, influence. But you, Clara, you're different. You're real. And that's exactly what I need." Clara studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. But all she saw was sincerity. She still didn't fully understand his motives, but for now, she was willing to take the risk. "All right," she said quietly. "I'm in." Dylan nodded, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Then let's begin." The first event Clara attended as Dylan's companion was a charity gala in the city. The venue was an opulent ballroom, filled with crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and guests dressed in designer gowns and tuxedos. Clara felt out of place the moment she stepped through the doors, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the extravagant outfits around her. Dylan moved through the crowd with ease, greeting guests with a practiced smile and engaging in small talk that Clara found mind-numbing. She stayed by his side, as the contract required, smiling politely and offering the occasional comment when addressed. But she felt like an outsider, watching a world she didn't belong to. As the evening wore on, Clara began to understand why Dylan had chosen her. The people around him were hungry for his attention, each one vying for his favor with thinly veiled desperation. But Dylan seemed to grow more distant with every conversation, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. It was during a lull in the evening, when they were standing by the bar, that Dylan leaned in and said quietly, "You see why I needed someone like you." Clara glanced around at the glittering crowd, at the fake smiles and shallow laughter. She nodded. "I get it now." The weeks that followed Clara's first event with Dylan passed in a blur. She found herself thrust into a world of luxury and excess, attending charity galas, high-profile dinners, and exclusive private gatherings, all while maintaining the facade of being Dylan's companion. The money started flowing into her account, and as promised, her bakery's financial troubles quickly became a thing of the past. She hired more staff, revamped the store, and even expanded her menu, drawing in more customers than ever before. But despite the newfound success of her business, Clara felt a growing sense of unease. Her life had become split into two distinct halves: the humble, grounded world of her bakery and the extravagant, high-society life she shared with Dylan. And while the money was pouring in, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She was beginning to realize that her arrangement with Dylan wasn't as simple as she'd first thought. There were rules, unspoken, but deeply felt. Dylan was careful, guarded, and kept their interactions strictly professional, even in the most personal of settings. He never crossed the boundaries of the contract, yet Clara often felt like she was part of a chess game he was playing, each move calculated with precision. And as the weeks went on, she couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in his demeanor, as if something far larger loomed beneath the surface. The turning point came during one of the most exclusive events of the year, a high-stakes auction for a charity that supported global education. The elite of the elite were in attendance, and the air buzzed with a mixture of excitement and competition. The event was held in the city's most luxurious hotel, with its grand ballroom adorned with sparkling chandeliers and towering floral arrangements. As Clara entered with Dylan by her side, she felt the weight of the stares from every corner of the room. She had grown accustomed to this. The curious looks, the whispered comments about her being Dylan Reyes' latest mystery woman. It was part of the job, after all. But tonight, something felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension in the room, a kind of anticipation that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. As they moved through the crowd, Clara noticed a group of sharply dressed men and women gathered near the bar, their eyes following her and Dylan with an intensity that set her on edge. One man in particular, a tall, gray-haired figure with piercing blue eyes, seemed to be watching Dylan with a strange mix of disdain and amusement. She didn't recognize him, but it was clear from the way people shifted around him that he was someone of importance. Dylan noticed her gaze and leaned in slightly. "That's Walter Reyes," he said quietly. "My uncle." Clara's breath hitched. She had heard rumors about Dylan's estranged family, but he had never mentioned them directly. According to what she'd gathered from whispers at previous events, Walter Reyes was a powerful figure in the world of finance, but more importantly, he had been locked in a bitter legal dispute with Dylan over control of the Reyes family fortune. Clara's stomach twisted with unease. She suddenly felt like she was in over her head. "It's he," Clara began, but Dylan cut her off with a tight smile. "He's not a concern," Dylan said, his voice firm. But Clara could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hand tightened around his glass. The evening continued, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. As the auction began, with guests bidding astronomical sums for rare artwork and luxury experiences, Dylan remained composed, yet distant. His usual charm seemed muted, and Clara could sense that his thoughts were elsewhere. Then, during the intermission, Dylan excused himself to speak with some of the event organizers, leaving Clara alone for a few moments. She wandered toward the balcony, needing some fresh air to clear her mind. As she stood outside, taking in the view of the glittering city skyline, she heard footsteps behind her. "Quite a spectacle, isn't it?" Clara turned to find Walter Reyes standing a few feet away, a glass of champagne in hand. His eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to see right through her. She forced a polite smile. "It certainly is." Walter stepped closer, his presence imposing yet strangely captivating. "I'm surprised to see you here. Dylan usually doesn't bring the same woman to more than one event." Clara stiffened at the comment, but she kept her expression neutral. "We have a professional arrangement." Walter chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "Oh, I'm sure you do. But let me give you a piece of advice, Ms. Martinez. My nephew, he's not as straightforward as he appears. He's playing a dangerous game, and if you're not careful, you'll find yourself caught in the middle of it." Clara's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Walter's smile faded, his expression turning cold. "You think this is just about attending parties and smiling for the cameras? No, my dear. Dylan has bigger plans, and he's using you to execute them. You're just a pawn in his scheme to keep control of the family's assets. The minute you're no longer useful to him, you'll be discarded." Clara's mouth went dry. She had always sensed that there was more to Dylan's world than he let on, but hearing it spelled out like this was unsettling. Could Walter be telling the truth? Was Dylan really using her as part of some larger plan? Before she could respond, Walter leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "If you're smart, you'll walk away before it's too late." With that, he turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving Clara standing alone on the balcony, her mind racing. When Dylan returned a few minutes later, Clara couldn't help but study him more closely. He was as poised and confident as ever, but now that she knew about the conflict with his uncle, she saw the tension lurking beneath the surface. She wanted to confront him, to ask him about what Walter had said, but she knew better than to cause a scene in the middle of the event. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, but Clara's thoughts were consumed by doubt. Was Walter right? Was she nothing more than a pawn in some kind of twisted family power struggle? Later that night, after the event had ended, Dylan drove Clara back to her apartment. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken tension. As they pulled up to her building, Clara finally worked up the courage to ask, "Dylan, what's going on between you and your family? Your uncle, he warned me that I'm being used." Dylan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Clara thought he might brush off the question, but then he sighed, a rare moment of vulnerability breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. "My family is complicated," he said quietly. "Walter and we don't see eye to eye. He's been trying to take control of the company ever since my father passed away. He thinks I'm too young, too reckless to run the business. So yes, there's conflict. But I'm not using you, Clara. I brought you into this because I needed someone I could trust, someone outside of that world." Clara wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that Dylan's intentions were pure, that their arrangement was just business, nothing more. But the doubt lingered. "And this contract, this arrangement we have, what happens when it's over? What happens to us?" Dylan turned to her, his eyes dark and intense. "When the contract is over, you'll be free to walk away. You'll have your money, your bakery, everything you need. But until then, I need you to stay by my side. There are things coming, things I can't explain yet, but I need you to trust me." Clara looked into his eyes, searching for the truth. There was something there, something deeper than the cold, calculated businessman she had first met. She nodded slowly, though her heart was heavy with uncertainty. "I'll stay," she said quietly, "but I need to know that I'm not just a pawn in your game." Dylan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Clara thought he might pull away. But then, in a rare moment of sincerity, he reached out and took her hand. "You're not a pawn, Clara. You're the only person I can trust right now." Clara's heart skipped a beat at his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that she was more than just a tool in his complicated world. But as she watched him drive away into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something big that would change everything. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Sweet Beginnings as Clara arrived at the bakery, her mind still clouded with thoughts from the night before. Dylan's words echoed in her head. "You're not a pawn, Clara. You're the only person I can trust right now." Trust. It was a fragile thing, especially in the world of wealth and power that Dylan inhabited. She had agreed to stay by his side. But the more she learned about his family, the more the unease gnawed at her. For the next few weeks, Clara threw herself into her work at the bakery, trying to find comfort in the simplicity of her daily routine. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of customers chatting over coffee, the warmth of the oven. It was all familiar, grounding. But even as she kneaded dough and frosted cakes, she couldn't escape the feeling that her life was spiraling out of control. The tension between Dylan and his uncle, Walter Reyes, had reached a boiling point. It was all anyone in the wealthy circles of Riverside could talk about. Whispers of legal battles, corporate takeovers, and family betrayal followed Dylan wherever he went. And Clara, though she tried to keep her distance, was inevitably pulled deeper into the drama. Her friends and family had noticed the change in her life. Elena, in particular, was growing more concerned with each passing day. They met for coffee one afternoon, the two of them sitting at their usual table in a quiet corner of the cafe. "You've been distant lately," Elena said, her eyes scanning Clara's face with worry. "You barely talk about the bakery anymore. And every time I see you, it's like your mind is somewhere else. What's going on, Clara?" Clara stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, struggling to find the right words. How could she explain everything that had been happening? How could she tell Elena that she had entered into a contract with a billionaire, that she was now entangled in his family's power struggles, that her life no longer felt like her own? "It's complicated," Clara said finally, her voice soft. "There's a lot going on with Dylan, with his family. I didn't realize how deep I'd gotten into this." Elena frowned, leaning in closer, Clara, are you okay? I mean, you're in this for the money, right? To help the bakery. But if this is starting to hurt you, it's not just the money anymore. Clara interrupted, her chest tightening as she spoke. I mean, yes, that's how it started. But now, I don't know. Dylan's in trouble. His uncle is trying to take everything from him. And I feel like I'm part of something I don't fully understand. Alina reached out and took Clara's hand. You don't have to be involved in his problems, Clara. You don't owe him anything beyond what you agreed to. And if this is starting to tear you apart, then maybe it's time to walk away. Clara wanted to walk away. She wanted to return to the simplicity of her life before Dylan Rice, to the bakery and the small, predictable world she had built for herself. But something inside her wouldn't let her. There was more to Dylan than the cold, calculating businessman she had first met. Beneath his icy exterior was a man who was struggling to keep his life from falling apart. And despite her better judgment, Clara couldn't help but feel drawn to him. That evening, Clara sat alone in her apartment, staring at the contract that had started it all. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had signed it, agreeing to play the part of Dylan's companion for a year. Now, halfway through that year, the lines between their professional arrangement and her personal feelings were becoming dangerously blurred. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Dylan. I need to see you. It's urgent. Clara's heart raced. She knew something was wrong before she even opened the message. Dylan had been distant in recent weeks, their interactions strained by the growing tension in his life. Without hesitating, Clara grabbed her coat and headed out the door. When Clara arrived at Dylan's estate, the atmosphere was tense. The usual calm, luxurious ambience was overshadowed by a sense of unease. The staff seemed on edge, whispering to each other as they moved through the grand halls. Clara had never seen the house so quiet, so oppressive. Something was definitely wrong. Dylan was waiting for her in his study, pacing by the window with his phone in hand. He looked tired, more tired than Clara had ever seen him. His normally sharp suit was rumpled, and there was a weariness in his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless battles. Dylan, Clara said softly as she entered the room. What's going on? He turned to face her, his expression grim. Walter, he's filed a lawsuit to strip me of my control of the company. He's using every legal loophole he can find. If he succeeds, I'll lose everything. Clara's heart sank. She had known that the conflict between Dylan and his uncle was serious, but she hadn't realized how dire the situation had become. What can you do? Can't you fight him in court? Dylan shook his head, running a hand through his hair in frustration. He's been planning this for years. He's got allies on the board of directors, and he's using the media to turn public opinion against me. I've been trying to hold it all together, but it's slipping away. Clara stepped closer, her voice filled with concern. Is there anything I can do to help? Dylan looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. You've already done so much, more than you know. But this is my fight. Clara placed a hand on his arm, the contract and their arrangement momentarily forgotten. You don't have to go through this alone, Dylan. We can figure this out, together. For a moment, Dylan didn't speak. He simply looked at her, as if weighing something in his mind. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, There's something I haven't told you, something I should have told you from the beginning. Clara's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Dylan took a deep breath. The reason I needed you to be my companion, it wasn't just for appearances. My father's will, there's a clause. In order to retain control of the company, I have to be married by the time I turn 45. If I'm not, everything goes to Walter. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. Wait, so this whole time, you've been planning to? Not planning, Dylan interrupted, his voice pained. I didn't want to force you into anything. That's why I didn't tell you. But now, with everything falling apart, I don't have a choice. If I lose the company, I lose everything my father built. I lose everything I've worked for. Clara's chest tightened as the weight of Dylan's confession sank in. She had known that their arrangement was unconventional, but she hadn't realized the full extent of what was at stake. This wasn't just about business or public appearances. Dylan was fighting for his family's legacy, and now he was asking her to be part of that fight in a way she had never anticipated. "Dylan," Clara said slowly, her voice trembling, "are you asking me to marry you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his gaze searching hers. "I'm asking you to help me. I know this isn't what you signed up for. And I know it's a lot to ask, but I can't do this without you." Clara's mind raced. This was too much, too fast. She had agreed to be Dylan's companion, to play a role in his world for a year. But marriage, that was something else entirely. It wasn't just a contract. It was a commitment, a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. She turned away, her thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions. "I don't know if I can do this, Dylan. This isn't what I wanted." "I know," Dylan said quietly, his voice laced with regret. "And I'm sorry for putting you in this position. But if we don't do this, Walter wins. He takes everything." Clara closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come so far, been through so much already. She had seen the man behind the billionaire, the vulnerability hidden beneath his carefully constructed facade. And despite her doubts, she couldn't deny that a part of her cared deeply for him. But marriage, could she really agree to something like that? After what felt like an eternity, Clara turned back to face him. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she said, "I need time to think." Dylan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take all the time you need. But just know, the clock is ticking." Clara left the estate that night with her mind in turmoil. The weight of Dylan's request hung heavy on her shoulders. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads, one that would determine the future of not just her life, but Dylan's as well. As she drove through the quiet streets of Riverside, the town that had always been her refuge, Clara couldn't help but wonder what the future held. She had entered into this arrangement for the cold winter wind swept through Riverside, rattling the bare branches of trees as Clara sat by the window in her apartment, her gaze fixed on the snow-covered street below. It had been 2 weeks since Dylan had asked her the impossible question, and in those 2 weeks, Clara's life had become a whirlwind of emotions, decisions, and doubts. Dylan's request to marry him, not out of love, but out of necessity to save his family's legacy, had upended everything Clara thought she knew about their arrangement. It wasn't just a contract anymore. It wasn't about attending events or keeping up appearances. It was about a life-altering decision that would change not only her future, but also the future of one of the wealthiest, most powerful families in the region. For days, Clara had avoided everyone, including Dylan. She hadn't responded to his calls or messages, and she had barely spoken to her friends. She needed space, time to think. Every moment she spent trying to reconcile her feelings, her mind seemed to spiral further into uncertainty. Could she really do this? Could she marry a man she wasn't in love with, even if it was for a greater purpose? And more importantly, could she live with herself after making such a choice? The knock on her door startled her out of her thoughts. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding as she stood up and walked over to the door. When she opened it, there stood Alina, her best friend and confidant, bundled up in a thick coat and scarf. Her face flushed from the cold. "Hey," Alina said softly, her eyes searching Clara's face for any sign of how she was holding up. "Hey," Clara replied, stepping aside to let her friend in. Alina shrugged off her coat and settled on the couch, looking around the apartment that had become Clara's sanctuary in the midst of all the chaos. She didn't waste any time before getting to the point. "You've been avoiding me," she said bluntly, her voice tinged with concern. "I know something's wrong. What's going on, Clara?" Clara sighed, sitting down beside her friend and folding her hands in her lap. It's Dylan. He asked me to marry him." Alina's eyes widened, her jaw dropping in surprise. "What? Dylan Rice, the billionaire, asked you to marry him? When did this happen? How did this happen? Clara shook her head, her hands trembling as she tried to explain. It's not what you think. It's not about love. It's about saving his company. There's a clause in his father's will that says he has to be married by the time he turns 45, or everything goes to his uncle. If he doesn't get married, Walter will take over the company. He's asked me to help him, but I don't know what to do. Elena was silent for a long moment, processing everything Clara had just told her. Then she leaned forward, her expression serious. Clara, you don't owe him anything. I know he's been good to you, and I know the money has helped you with the bakery, but this is a whole different level. You can't just marry someone to save their company. That's not who you are. Clara looked down, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. I know, but it's not just about the company. Dylan, he's not the person I thought he was when I first met him. I've seen sides of him that are vulnerable, that are real. He's under so much pressure, and I can't help but feel like I should do something to help him. Elena's expression softened, and she placed a comforting hand on Clara's shoulder. Clara, you're one of the kindest, most caring people I know. But you can't let that cloud your judgment. You've built this bakery from the ground up, and you've done it on your own terms. Don't let yourself be pulled into someone else's mess, especially if it means sacrificing your happiness. Clara nodded, but the uncertainty still gnawed at her. I just don't know what the right thing to do is. I don't want to abandon him, but I also don't want to lose myself in the process. Elena sighed, sitting back on the couch. Only you can decide what's right for you, Clara. But you need to think about what's best for you, not just for Dylan. Later that night, after Elena had left, Clara sat in silence, staring at the contract she had signed months ago. The paper felt like a reminder of the distance she had traveled from the life she once knew. Her bakery was flourishing. Her financial worries had vanished, but at what cost? She had become a fixture in a world she didn't fully understand, a world of wealth, power, and deception. Her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness of the room. It was a message from Dylan. I need to know your decision. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of those words. Dylan was waiting for her answer. But what was she supposed to say? How could she marry a man, not out of love, but out of obligation? And yet, how could she walk away, knowing that Dylan's entire future rested on her decision? The following morning, Clara drove to Dylan's estate. The snow had begun to melt, leaving the roads slick and muddy. The grand gates of the Reyes mansion opened as she approached, and she felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. This was it. This was the moment where she had to make the decision that would define her future. When she entered Dylan's study, he was standing by the window, just as he had been the night he revealed the truth about his father's will. His back was to her, and for a moment, Clara hesitated. She could still walk away. She could leave this life behind and return to the bakery, to the simplicity of the world she knew. But something kept her rooted in place. A part of her couldn't leave, not like this. Dylan, Clara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face her, his expression a mixture of hope and desperation. Clara, have you made your decision? Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. I've thought about this a lot, and I don't think I can marry you, not like this. Not for a contract, not to save your company. That's not who I am. Dylan's face fell, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. He nodded slowly, his voice strained. I understand. But Clara continued, stepping closer to him. I don't want to abandon you either. I care about you, Dylan, more than I expected to. I'm willing to stand by your side and help you in any way I can. But marriage should be about more than a business arrangement. Dylan's gaze softened, and for the first time in weeks, Clara saw a hint of the man she had grown to care for. I never wanted to force you into this. I just didn't know how else to protect what my father built. But you're right. Marriage should be more than just a contract. Clara nodded, relief washing over her. We can find another way to fight Walter. Together. Dylan smiled faintly, though the weight of his troubles still hung over him. I don't know what that way is yet, but with you by my side, I feel like I might actually stand a chance. Clara reached out, taking his hand. For the first time since their arrangement had begun, it felt real. It wasn't about money or power anymore. It was about two people, standing together in the face of uncertainty, trying to figure out their place in the world. The next few months were a blur of legal battles, media storms, and tense board meetings. Walter Rise launched a full-scale attack on Dylan's control of the company, using every dirty trick in the book to discredit him. But with Clara's unwavering support, Dylan fought back. Together, they navigated the murky waters of corporate warfare, using not just strategy, but the strength of their bond to withstand the pressure. As the weeks passed, Clara realized that her role in Dylan's life had shifted. She was no longer just his companion. She was his partner. And while they hadn't married, their connection had deepened in a way that neither of them had anticipated. They weren't bound by a contract anymore. They were bound by something far more meaningful: trust, respect, and a growing affection that neither of them could deny. In the end, Dylan won the battle. Walter's plans to seize control of the company were thwarted, and the board of directors voted in favor of Dylan's continued leadership. It wasn't an easy victory, and the scars of the conflict would remain for years to come. But Dylan had managed to protect his family's legacy, and he had done it with Clara by his side. Months later, as spring blossomed in Riverside, Clara stood in the middle of her bakery, watching the customers come and go. The past year had been the most tumultuous of her life, but it had also been the most transformative. She had learned that strength wasn't just about fighting battles. It was about knowing when to walk away and when to stay. Dylan still came to the bakery regularly, sometimes to help her bake, sometimes just to sit and watch her work. Their relationship had grown into something real, something that no contract could define. And while the future was still uncertain, one thing was